It was a typical sunny afternoon in the park. The chirping of birds, kids laughing, and joggers running along the paths filled the air. Dwayne, just another face in the crowd, sat quietly on a bench, blending in with everyone else. He wasn't trying to attract attention, just wanting to relax for a moment. With his hoodie up and sunglasses on, he looked like any other person taking a break. But as Dwayne sat there, enjoying the peace, Officer Mitchell walked by. He had a reputation. Not a good one. Officer Mitchell was known for judging people quickly, especially those who didn't fit his idea of who belonged in the park. It was clear from the way he carried himself, his posture straight, chest out, his eyes scanning the crowd like he was looking for trouble. When his eyes landed on Dwayne, sitting by himself, something in Officer Mitchell's mind clicked. He didn't like what he saw. Dwayne didn't fit the officer's idea of who should be in the park. Maybe it was his casual clothes, or the way he wasn't doing anything in particular. The officer's thoughts turned into a voice in his head. He muttered under his breath. Dwayne, still sitting peacefully, didn't notice Officer Mitchell's watchful gaze at first. But then, the officer started walking toward him, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel. There was no friendly hello or excuse me, just the officer's cold command. Hey, you! What are you doing here? You can't just hang out. Dwayne, taken aback by the sudden attention, glanced up, confused. He'd been minding his own business, and now this officer was confronting him. As he pulled his sunglasses down to get a better look, Dwayne's eyes were sharp and calm. He wasn't going to let the officer's attitude throw him off. He simply said, "I'm just enjoying the park." But Officer Mitchell didn't like that answer. His face twisted into a sneer, as if Dwayne had said something outrageous. "People like you don't just sit around in a place like this," he spat. His tone was dismissive and rude, like Dwayne didn't belong. Dwayne's eyebrow arched. "People like me? What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, his voice steady. He wasn't intimidated. He was annoyed, but didn't let his anger show. The officer wasn't having it. His hand gripped his baton tightly, his temper rising. "Don't get smart with me," he warned, his voice now dripping with anger. "Get up and leave. Now." But Dwayne wasn't moving. "I'm not breaking any laws," he said. "I have every right to sit here." The officer's patience snapped. His face turned bright red, veins bulging in his neck. He raised the baton and swung it with all his strength. The sound of it hitting Dwayne's back echoed through the park, causing nearby people to gasp. They were all watching in shock as the officer's attack landed. The moment the baton struck, Dwayne's calm demeanor shifted. He slowly stood up, towering over the officer. His muscles rippled as he straightened up, and the crowd could feel the change in the air. The Rock wasn't just a regular person, and Officer Mitchell had just made a huge mistake. Dwayne's eyes locked onto the officer's. His voice, cold and controlled, spoke with authority. "Big mistake." The crowd could feel the tension. Officer Mitchell's bravado was gone. He had underestimated the power of the man in front of him. He scoffed, thinking the baton would somehow still give him an advantage. But Dwayne's next move showed just how wrong the officer was, that it was just another regular day in the park. The sun was shining, and people were scattered around enjoying the weather. Families picnicked, kids played on the swings, and joggers passed by. Dwayne, sitting alone on a park bench, was trying to catch a moment of peace. His hoodie was up, his sunglasses blocking out the sun. He wasn't bothering anyone, just enjoying the quiet. But then, Officer Carter walked into the scene. Officer Carter had always been a bit quick to judge people. He was used to sizing up everyone he came across, especially in places like the park, where he felt he needed to keep an eye on who was around. He walked through the park, his sharp gaze darting from person to person. When he spotted Dwayne sitting by himself, Officer Carter's eyes narrowed. Dwayne didn't look like he belonged there, or at least that's what the officer thought. He didn't have the right look for someone who should be casually hanging out in the park. Officer Carter had already decided that Dwayne needed to be questioned. He marched over to Dwayne without a second thought. "Hey?" The officer barked, his voice harsh. "What are you doing here? You can't just sit around in a place like this." Dwayne blinked, not expecting to be confronted. He was just trying to relax, but now he was caught off guard by the officer's attitude. "I'm just enjoying the park," Dwayne replied calmly, looking up at the officer. But Officer Carter didn't seem to like that answer. He crossed his arms and sneered. "You don't belong here. People like you don't just hang out in nice parks like this," he said, his voice dripping with judgment. His words were sharp, and it was clear he had already made up his mind about Dwayne. Dwayne's eyebrows raised in confusion. "What do you mean, people like me?" he asked, his voice steady, but now with a bit of edge. He wasn't going to let the officer's rude tone slide without saying something. Without a second thought, Officer Carter snapped back. "Just get up and leave. Now. Before I make this more difficult for you." But Dwayne didn't move. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he said, standing his ground. "I have every right to be here." Officer Carter's patience was running thin. His face twisted with anger, his hands clenching into fists. "I said, leave," he shouted, stepping closer and getting in Dwayne's face. Suddenly, Officer Carter raised his baton and swung it down at Dwayne, hitting him in the back. The sound of the baton landing echoed in the air, and the shock rippled through the crowd that had gathered around. Dwayne stood completely still for a moment. But then, he slowly rose to his feet, his eyes locking with the officer's. His calm demeanor hadn't changed, but now there was a fire in his gaze that made Officer Carter hesitate. "I'm not the one you should be messing with," Dwayne said quietly, his voice calm but full of power. The crowd fell silent as they watched the two men stand face to face. Officer Carter's bravado quickly began to fade. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Dwayne wasn't just anyone, and he wasn't about to let the officer get away with what he'd just done. Things had gotten intense in the park, but little did Officer Daniels know that Dwayne wasn't someone to mess with. Just as he thought he had the situation under control, the tables were about to turn in a way he never expected. After Dwayne stood tall, refusing to back down, Officer Daniels found himself questioning his own confidence. What had he gotten himself into? "You should have just listened," Officer Daniels muttered, trying to maintain control, but it was clear he was now rattled. Dwayne's eyes were steady and unwavering. He wasn't scared, and that made Officer Daniels uncomfortable. Dwayne stood there for a moment, watching the officer, not moving an inch. "You think I don't belong here because of how I look, huh?" Dwayne asked, his voice low but filled with power. Officer Daniels' eyes flickered, and for the first time, he felt a bit of doubt. The crowd around them was watching closely now. The air felt thick with tension, like something big was about to happen. Just then, a car pulled up. It was a sleek black SUV, and as soon as it stopped, the door opened and out stepped a tall woman in a sharp suit. It was Officer Daniels' worst nightmare. Special Agent Regina Carter, Dwayne's mother. Officer Daniels' eyes widened in surprise. He had no idea who Dwayne really was. But now, everything was starting to make sense. "Is there a problem here, officer?" Special Agent Regina Carter's voice cut through the air like a knife. The power in her tone was undeniable, and everyone within earshot instantly realized who she was. Dwayne's mother wasn't just any officer. She was a high-ranking FBI agent, someone who could easily put an end to this situation with a single word. Officer Daniels froze, realizing he had just picked the wrong person to mess with. I'm just making sure everything's all right here, ma'am," Officer Daniels stammered, his previous confidence now completely gone. Special Agent Carter's eyes locked onto Officer Daniels, and she raised an eyebrow. "You were harassing my son," she said, her voice calm but filled with authority. "I think it's time for you to leave." Dwayne couldn't help but smirk. Officer Daniels had no idea what kind of trouble he had just gotten himself into. As Officer Daniels slowly backed away, Dwayne turned to his mom. "Thanks for showing up," he said, his tone a mix of relief and pride. "No problem," Regina Carter replied with a smile. "Just remember, always stand your ground." The crowd that had been watching the scene unfold stood in stunned silence. They had witnessed something rare, a complete shift of power in just a few moments. And in that moment, everyone realized that sometimes it's not about the uniform you wear, it's about who you really are. Officer Harris had been patrolling the quiet streets of the neighborhood, minding his own business. But then he saw Dwayne. And that's when everything went downhill. At first, Officer Harris didn't think twice about pulling over Dwayne. After all, he had been looking suspicious, walking around like he didn't belong. His hoodie was up, his hands shoved in his pockets, and he looked like trouble. Harris thought he was just another guy up to no good. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" Officer Harris shouted, stepping out of his car. He wasn't about to let Dwayne get away without a little questioning. Dwayne slowly turned around, looking calm as could be. "What's the problem, officer?" he asked, his voice even. Officer Harris sized him up, trying to see if Dwayne was hiding something. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, his tone sharp. "I'm just walking," Dwayne answered, unfazed. "Why?" Harris wasn't convinced. He stepped closer. "You look like you're up to something. You're not supposed to be here. I think I need to check your ID." But just as Officer Harris reached for his radio to call in, something unexpected happened. A black SUV pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and out stepped a woman dressed in a sharp suit. Regina Carter. The look on Officer Harris's face instantly changed. He had no idea what was happening, but he could feel the shift in the air. "Is there a problem, Officer Harris?" Regina asked, her voice calm, but her presence was undeniable. Harris's eyes widened. He was now staring at someone he had no idea could change everything. Regina Carter wasn't just any regular officer. She was an FBI special agent, and she was Dwayne's mom. I was just questioning your son here," Officer Harris stammered, suddenly unsure of himself. Regina raised an eyebrow. "You were questioning him for what reason, exactly?" Harris stood there, dumbfounded. The power that came with her title and the confidence in Dwayne's eyes made him rethink everything. He felt small in comparison. Dwayne looked at Officer Harris, his expression calm. "You don't have to worry anymore. I'm good." Regina's eyes stayed on Harris. "I think it's best if you let my son go now." The officer didn't argue. He nodded slowly, his face turning red from embarrassment. He had no idea who he had just crossed paths with, and now it was too late. As Officer Harris walked away. "Thanks for coming, Mom." "No problem," Regina said with a smile. "Just remember, no matter where you are or who you're with, always stand tall and never let anyone make you feel less than you are." Dwayne gave a small nod. He was learning a powerful lesson in that moment. Never underestimate anyone, especially when you don't know who they really are. Dwayne had been walking down the street when he noticed a police car pulling up behind him. He didn't panic, but he also knew what was coming. He had seen it before, officers stopping people who didn't look like they belonged. The car door slammed open, and Officer Williams stepped out, eyeing Dwayne. The officer's tone was firm as he spoke. "Hey, you! Stop right there." Dwayne stopped in his tracks. He didn't have anything to hide, but he also knew that being young and black could make any encounter feel like a challenge. "What's going on, officer?" Dwayne asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Where are you headed?" Officer Williams asked, circling around him, his eyes sharp as he scanned Dwayne. "I'm just walking home," Dwayne replied. "What's the problem?" Officer Williams looked him over. "You don't look like you belong here. I think I'll need to check your ID." Dwayne knew the drill. He kept calm, even though his stomach tightened. But before he could say anything else, a car pulled up behind them. A sleek black SUV parked, and a woman in a sharp business suit stepped out. It was none other than Regina Carter, Dwayne's mom, and a high-ranking FBI special agent. The change in the air was instant. Officer Williams froze when he saw her. He wasn't expecting her to show up, and he definitely wasn't expecting the power she held. "Is there a problem here, Officer Williams?" Regina asked, her voice calm but commanding. Williams stood speechless, staring at her. He knew exactly who she was. Special Agent Regina Carter wasn't someone you messed with. "I was just asking your son some questions," Williams muttered, trying to save face. Regina raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "For what reason?" Dwayne stood tall beside her, a small smile forming on his face. "I think I've got everything handled now." Williams swallowed hard. He had no idea who he was dealing with. He hadn't realized who Dwayne's mother was, and now he felt small. "Officer Williams," Regina said, her tone cool. I think you can let my son go now. Williams nodded quickly, stepping back. He didn't argue. He simply turned and walked back to his car, clearly embarrassed. Dwayne turned to his mom, his voice quieter now. Thanks for showing up, Mom. Regina smiled back. Always stand tall, no matter what. People might try to judge you, but never let them change who you are. Dwayne nodded. It was a lesson he'd carry with him for the rest of his life. Michael was used to walking home alone after school, but this day felt different. He had just turned the corner when he saw the flashing lights of a police car pull up behind him. His heart raced as the car stopped right next to him, and the officer stepped out. It was Officer Harris. Hey, you! Stop right there! Officer Harris shouted, his voice stern. Michael froze, trying to stay calm. He had never been in trouble before, but he knew all too well that just looking the way he did could get people's attention in the wrong way. What's the problem, officer? Michael asked, his voice steady but nervous. You fit the description of someone who is just seen around here. I need to see some ID, Officer Harris said, looking him up and down like he was guilty of something. Michael was confused. He hadn't done anything wrong, but he also knew it didn't always matter. Why do you need to see my ID? Michael asked, trying to understand why he was being stopped. Officer Harris didn't answer. He just took another step forward, closing the gap between them. Just then, Michael's phone rang. It was his mom, and she wasn't just anyone. She was Special Agent Regina Carter, an FBI officer with a lot of power and respect. Michael quickly answered the call. Mom, I'm being stopped by Officer Harris. What do I do? Regina's voice came through the phone, clear and calm. Stay right where you are. I'm coming. Within minutes, Michael saw a black car pull up. The door opened, and out stepped his mom in a sharp suit. Officer Harris's eyes widened when he saw her. Is there a problem here, Officer Harris? Regina asked, her voice calm but firm. She had a way of making people pay attention. Officer Harris didn't say anything at first. He was stunned. He had no idea who Michael's mom was, and now he realized his mistake. I was just questioning him, Officer Harris mumbled, clearly rattled. Regina didn't blink. For what reason? Michael stood next to her, feeling stronger now that his mom was there. I don't think I need to answer any more questions, Michael said, his voice more confident. Officer Harris cleared his throat and took a step back. I'll let you go then, he said, his face flushed with embarrassment. Regina nodded. Thank you, Officer Harris. As they walked away, Michael looked up at his mom, who gave him a reassuring smile. Always stand tall, Michael, she said. No one has the right to make you feel less than you are. Michael smiled back, feeling a little taller than he did before. Jesse was walking home late from the library, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The street was quiet, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But just as he was about to turn the corner, he heard the unmistakable sound of a police car pulling up behind him. Before he knew it, the sirens blared, and the car came to a stop beside him. Jesse's heart skipped a beat as the officer inside rolled down the window. It was Officer Lucas. Hey, kid. What are you doing out here so late? Officer Lucas asked, his voice rough. Jesse was startled but stayed calm. Just walking home from the library, sir. You sure about that? You're walking around in the middle of nowhere. You know, that seems suspicious, Officer Lucas said, looking him over like he was guilty of something. Jesse was about to respond when Officer Lucas stepped out of the car and walked up to him. I'm gonna need to see some ID, the officer said, his tone cold. Jesse's mind raced. He hadn't done anything wrong. But he also knew that being in the wrong place at the wrong time could be dangerous. Why do you need to see my ID, officer? Jesse asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Officer Lucas didn't answer, just reached for his belt. Jesse's heart pounded in his chest. Before things could escalate, Jesse's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was his aunt, Agent Angela Williams. She worked for the government and was used to dealing with tough situations. Jesse quickly answered the call. Aunt Angela, I'm being stopped by Officer Lucas. What should I do? He whispered into the phone. Stay calm, Jesse. I'm coming right now, Angela's voice was calm and collected. A few minutes later, Jesse saw his aunt's car pull up. She stepped out, looking confident and professional in her suit. Officer Lucas's eyes widened when he saw her. "Is there a problem here, Officer Lucas?" Angela asked, her voice firm but polite. Officer Lucas seemed a little shaken but tried to keep his cool. "I was just asking him some questions." "He's acting suspicious." Angela didn't flinch. "And why exactly is he acting suspicious?" Jesse felt a wave of relief wash over him. His aunt was one of the best in her field, and she wasn't going to let anything happen to him. Officer Lucas stammered but didn't answer. Angela gave him a look that made it clear he was in the wrong. "You know, it's illegal to stop someone without cause," she said, her voice steady. Officer Lucas took a deep breath and backed off. "I'll let you go," he said, clearly embarrassed. "Thank you," Angela said, turning to Jesse with a reassuring smile. "Are you okay?" Jesse nodded. "Yeah. Thanks, Aunt Angela. Just remember, Jesse," she said, "never let anyone make you feel less than you are. You have the right to stand up for yourself." Jesse smiled back, feeling stronger than before. With his aunt by his side, he knew he was never alone.